My name is Ron Peters, and I'm a Regents Professor with the University of Oklahoma at the Carl Albert Congressional Research and Studies Center. Today is March 21st, 2016, and I'm joined today by Ambassador Jim Jones. Ambassador Jones represented the 1st District in Tulsa from 1972 until 1986-87. And in 1981, he was chosen as the chair of the House Budget Committee, and in that capacity, Mr. Jones was the primary architect of the Democratic response to the policies of the Reagan administration during what later became known as the Reagan Revolution in public policy. So today we're going to visit about the events of 1981. And Jim, I want to welcome you to OU. And the first question that I thought I would ask you is to talk a little bit about how you came to become the chairman of the House Budget Committee in the first instance, and how your path to become chair of the Budget Committee shaped the approach that you took to the job in 1981.
Well, it all started, I guess, in 1972 when I had my first successful run for Congress from the 1st District. In that capacity, there were a number of things that people were telling me that they had lost confidence in their government, that they had lost interest, that they didn't feel they had power to influence policy. And that was partly the Vietnam War, where they felt they didn't have a voice in how the war started and how it was being processed. It was true in budget policy, where deficits were increasing, and it was true in a whole range of policies. So a good part of my campaign was we're going to bring power back to the people of the 1st District, and that I was going to fight for things that let them have a real voice in government. So in my first term in 1974, we passed, among other things, we passed a Budget Control and Impoundment Act, which started the process to have Congress build its own budget, to have Congress establish a Congressional Budget Office that would provide professional help and analysis of the budget that could compete with the executive branch and the Office of Management and Budget. And I ran for a seat on the Budget Committee and was elected in 1978. In those days, you had a 6-year term. The first Budget Committee chairman was Bob Jimo of Connecticut, and his time on the Budget Committee was over, and so I ran for the chairmanship in 1980.
You were competing in that election with Congressman David Obey of Wisconsin and Congressman Paul Simon of Illinois, in what was a very close election. What happened in that race?
Well, I had been positioned as someone who was somewhat expert on tax policy and economic policy, and had been the prime architect of a bipartisan tax bill that passed and became the 1978 Tax Act, which lowered taxes for the middle class, increased incentives for investment by industry by cutting capital gains tax in half, for example. And so the position that I took was that with Ronald Reagan having been elected president in 1980, there were going to be budget cuts, there was going to be belt tightening, and that I was best positioned to preserve necessary programs and to moderate the tax cuts in a way that ultimately would produce a balanced budget. The opposition, David Obey and Paul Simon, were from the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, which was the majority in the House caucus. And it was a very close race. David Obey particularly wanted to preserve all of the Democratic programs, social programs. And so in the first ballot, we tied, David and I, and Paul Simon came in third and dropped out of the race then. The second ballot, David and I tied again. And in the third ballot, I won by 5 votes.
I noticed that in the second ballot tie, it was 118 to 118, and then you won 121 to 116. Do you know who the three were?
I don't know who the three were, but I know that two of them that were supporting David Obey were playing handball in the House gym and didn't get over to vote.
Well, that's something that didn't get reported in the news.
One of the things that I had wanted to do was develop a really serious bipartisan budget that would get a real handle, would get a control of the deficits that were beginning to grow, and lead us to a more solid economic future. In that process, Ronald Reagan was elected in November of 1980, and he appointed a congressman from Michigan named Dave Stockman. And David and I had worked together on some bipartisan efforts in health policy in the Congress, and so we knew each other. David and I started visiting, and we started trying to figure out what could be a bipartisan budget. We agreed through November, December, January, February. We agreed on spending cuts on about 80% of the budget. We disagreed in certain areas. We disagreed on how quickly the administration wanted to ramp up defense spending and how deeply the administration wanted to cut spending for things like education. But we agreed on about 80% of the spending cuts, and we disagreed on the tax proposal. The Kemp-Roth tax bill, which was cutting taxes across the board, I think it was 10% a year for 3 years, was what the Reagan administration was pushing. And we were pushing a tax bill that put more emphasis on investment and less emphasis on the individual cuts. And the individual cuts we really targeted to the middle class. So we had pretty much agreed or talked about taking a budget to the House floor that would agree on most of the spending cuts and disagree on the tax bills, and just taking that to the floor and let the normal legislative process work its way. Then, at the end of March of that year, the assassination attempt on President Reagan changed the situation considerably. And that's when the partisanship began, and it was difficult getting a budget put together.
Could you speak a little bit more about how you won the election against David Obey? What was the nature of the coalition of members that was supporting you as opposed to those that were supporting him?
Well, first of all, the base of my support was people from the South and Southwest who were much more conservative than other members of the Democratic caucus. Added to that were people from states like Indiana, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, people like Lee Hamilton, who was more liberal but was pretty solid on economic policy. And they had supported us in the tax bill of 1978. They trusted me, and they voted for me. So it was very close, but we through basically the arguments we made on economic policy and the need to be serious about the budget, we picked up some votes that we ordinarily would not have gotten.
By the time this election took place, Reagan had won the election, and so it was known that he was coming into Washington with a popular mandate that he would certainly claim based on the size of his electoral victory. And he'd also campaigned on the Kemp-Roth tax cut and the essential features of the program that they were going to present. So I'm wondering whether in this contestation between you and David Obey, was there a philosophical or a strategic question as to the best approach for the Democrats to take? In other words, would Obey have been more inclined with a liberal base of support in the Democratic Study Group and other liberal members to say we're going to fight Reagan to the end, as opposed to you being more likely to say we can reach an accommodation with this president?
Yeah. No, I think that's accurate. Dave Obey basically wanted to defend the Democratic programs and the Democratic issues on the budget without giving any kind of a compromise. My position was that The electorate had spoken in 1980. They had elected Ronald Reagan. They had elected a Republican Senate. And the fact was that our budget deficits were growing and that something was going to be done about it. And my argument was we can influence the outcome of of the budget and of the cuts and of the taxes if we are able to put together a working coalition with key Republicans, and we can save most of the Democratic programs, but not all of them. But we have to be smart about this. So, and defending every Democratic program was just not in the cards.
In listening to you describe all of this now, I am reminded of the newspaper coverage that was given to you in January of 1981, in which several of the articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal characterized you as being a conservative Democrat from Tulsa, Oklahoma, who aspired to reach an accommodation with the White House if it was possible. So it sounds to me as though what you're now saying was essentially what you were saying at the time.
Yeah, I don't remember those articles. I was so busy I didn't read many of the articles that were written. But no, to me it was a fact of life. There was going to be tighter budgets, and the question was, could we put together a budget that made sense for more of the people, and took out some of the harshness that we thought might be coming down the road from the administration.
Well, was there a residue of distrust among the more liberal Democrats, especially those in the leadership, recognizing that you did come from a different perspective than them?
Yeah, in those days, there was a divide between the North and South in terms of the Democrats elected. The North being much more liberal and the South being much more conservative. The sort of the rap on Oklahoma was the fact that it was an oil state and there was a lot of antipathy toward the oil industry, and the question of whether or not I could be fair to everybody. I mean, there was those sub rosa kind of issues that people talked about. But in the final analysis, they had seen me for, 6 or 8 years almost in the Congress putting together different kinds of packages. They knew that my particular interest was to put something together that was both fair and workable. And so in the final analysis, it worked out pretty well.
As David Stockman describes all of this in the book that he wrote called The Triumph of Politics, he gives a lot of attention to the significance of the Kemp-Roth tax cut as being the one part of all of Reagan's program to which the president himself was most committed.
Right.
And they conjoin that then with the accelerated depreciation, the 1053, to form the backbone of what their tax policy was going to be. Now, it was known that the tax fight was going to take place later in the summer, but it was going to be presaged by the budget resolution, which was going to create the space for the tax cut. So Stockman describes the concern that he had that his own economic projections showed that these tax cuts were going to create a substantial deficit unless there was a substantial reduction in spending, which wasn't going to come from the defense budget because they were proposing to substantially increase it. So therefore, all of the pressure to cut spending was going to come either in entitlement spending or on the domestic discretionary part of the budget. So I'm wondering if you say that during January and February, during the period prior to the president having been shot, that it seemed to you as though there was prospect for compromise because you were having these ongoing conversations. I'm wondering how that could have played itself out, given that the Stockman's own figures showed that these huge deficits were going to be projected. So when you say that there was 80% agreement,
yeah, that was on the spending side.
Not just on the spending side.
Right, and we totally disagreed on the tax side. The 1053 was actually the second stage of the Jones-Steiger tax bill that was passed in 1978, the first stage being cutting in half the capital gains taxes to spur investment. second one to spur capital investment was the 1053 approach. And but where we disagreed was fundamentally on the Kemp-Roth tax cuts for individuals. And in that connection, Reagan really did buy into that, because as a movie actor, he paid, I think the tax rate was 91%, and so he chafed under high taxes. If you made a lot of money, you were taxed at a very high rate. And so he bought into the Kemp-Roth. It was very simplistic in terms of understanding it, and so he bought into that, and that was the cornerstone of their economic policy. We pointed out that, as Stockman knew privately, that you cannot cut taxes to that degree without having offsetting spending cuts, and that the theory that if you cut taxes a lot, you would actually get more revenue was just not viable. And so we took the position that it was not viable. Stockman, I think, wanted to sell the whole program, and he basically took the opposite position, which he later admitted was false.
Well, he describes himself as having essentially taken your position in the internal deliberations. He was for a smaller tax cut. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because on the one hand, he had associated himself closely with Jack Kemp and people on the outside like Arthur Laffer and Jude Winniski at the Wall Street Journal, who were advocates of the so-called supply-side tax cut policy. But Stockman could never make the numbers add up if you cut the marginal tax rates that much. So that then led to the creation of what came to be called Rosy Scenario, which was this set of economic assumptions that was projecting dramatic economic growth and a decline in inflation and the rest of it, a decline in interest rates, that was going to then precipitate dramatically new revenues that would come in as a result of. But they knew that at least Stockman knew that these were unrealistic.
Right.
You did too, I assume.
I did, and that was another advantage of having the Congressional Budget Office, because it had very thorough research and pointed that out, that the numbers just didn't add up. And Stockman knew in his own mind that they didn't add up, and that he was going to have a real battle if you're talking about OMB numbers versus Congressional Budget Office numbers, and that ones were accurate and the other was not.
Well, your strategy, as I've read about it, was to try to put together a budget that would show a lower deficit. That was going to be the critical factor. If you could show a lower deficit, then it would be more responsible, and that might have an appeal to the boll weevil Southern conservatives and other people that were concerned about balanced budgets. To do that, then, you had to project a lower tax cut, less of a tax cut, and then less in the way of spending cuts, and you were able to do that. You were able to make that proposal. So the question then becomes, why did he win and you lost on that on the first budget resolution?
One person, Ronald Reagan. Everything really changed after, I think it was March 31, when the assassination attempt was made on Reagan. President Reagan handled that whole episode beautifully. He came to Congress within days after he left the hospital, addressed the joint session of Congress. It was a very moving experience. And internally, the White House decided that... Sorry about that. Internally, it was decided that, internally in the White House, it was decided that they had to really show the strength of the president and the presidency after this assassination attempt, and that they had to have a showdown vote if necessary. So they were able to get every Republican in the Congress, in the House, to toe the line and vote for the Reagan budget. And then they targeted roughly 35 what we called boll weevils, mostly from the South, very conservative Democrats. And they targeted their congressional districts with television ads, with newspaper ads, with all kinds of speakers coming into their districts and putting enormous pressure on them to support the Reagan budget. They didn't get into the specifics of the budget, but it was basically support Ronald Reagan or, we'll vote against you. And so with about 30-some Democrats and the solid phalanx of Republicans, they were able to pass the budget and the reconciliation bill and all. In the course of putting those things together and making it attractive enough for all the Republicans and the Southern Democrats to support it, they added or subtracted from their program enough to get those votes and to win. So, but Ronald Reagan was the main factor there. He was an excellent communicator. He made the people believe in him, and that if his program were to pass, times would be better. Everybody would benefit. Those who were not rich now could become rich, that was just something. Facts didn't make any difference. It was what President Reagan said would happen versus what we said was a factual result.
You brought your chairman's mark for the budget resolution to the committee on Monday, April 8th. And the preceding weekend, you mentioned, President Reagan gave his Saturday morning radio address in which he basically was critical of what he anticipated you were going to propose. Now, this is about a week after the assassination attempt. So you indicated that shifted things such that the communications between you and the White House broke down after the assassination attempt. And so I'm wondering to what extent then the budget that you proposed was no longer a compromise budget, but was instead a budget where you aimed to win on the floor of the House.
Well, I think, and I have to trust my memory, I think that was the 1982 budget in which I talked to Reagan.
Oh, okay. I didn't understand that.
Yeah, and because we did not have all communications after the assassination attempt in 81, all communications with the Congress, Democrats in Congress, with me and other committee chairmen were broken off.
Okay.
And it was basically obvious that the Reagan administration, that Dave Stockman was going to put together a budget and have an up or down vote. It was a showdown. And so with that in mind, we had to mark up, we on the Democratic side of the House Budget Committee had to mark up our own budget. We had some idea what was going to be proposed by Dave Stockman, and we tried to make it better. So we did have lower deficits. We did have spending cuts that were different, and we did have a tax program that was different and smaller than the Reagan proposal. So there was no communications with the executive branch, and we went into markup.
I believe you carried the mark with all the Democratic votes, save that of Phil Gramm.
Yep.
And so it was a party line vote.
It was.
Except for that. Talk a little bit about Phil Gramm's role in all this. At some point, he began working with David Stockman in the administration. How did that come to your attention, and then what happened as a result?
Well, I can't remember how I found out about it, although I think Dave Stockman told me. But Phil Gramm, who had been a very conservative Democrat elected from Waco, Texas, had basically pleaded with me and with Majority Leader Jim Wright to get a position on the Budget Committee in 1980. We agreed to that, put him on the committee on the basis that he could argue all of his positions that he wanted, but in the final analysis, if we needed his vote, he had to be a team player, to which he agreed. What we didn't know after all the communications were cut off with the White House, what we didn't know as we went into the Democratic caucus of the Budget Committee to put together a budget was that Phil Gramm, after each of those sessions, would be calling Dave Stockman and telling him what we were thinking about so that Stockman could counter the good parts of our budget as they constructed their own budget. And that to me was totally untrustworthy. I don't remember for sure how we found out about that, but when we did, we basically kicked Phil Gramm off the committee. He resigned from Congress, went back to Texas, changed political parties to a Republican, ran and won as a Republican, which is where he should have been to begin with, I guess. You just don't make a commitment and then disregard it the way he did. So that's how that unfolded.
Did you have a direct conversation with him once you had discovered what he was doing about it?
I did, and I think Jim Wright did, and I think some others did. And basically, his position was that he's going to support the Reagan budget, and he's going to do everything he can to pass it.
Yeah, interesting. So the boll weevils who became the swing votes on all these pieces of legislation, they sided with Reagan for what reason?
Primarily because they were getting so much heat from their congressional districts with the targeted advertising and the targeted campaign that the White House was making in each of their congressional districts, that they felt the majority of the population was such that if they didn't support the Reagan budget, they could be defeated the next go-round, which was clearly the implication, if not the express statements of the White House. And so they were just under enormous political pressure. I mean, I felt it in my own congressional district that they came in and targeted me in my district, as they did people like Mike Siner in his district. Anyone that they thought might be able to be pressured by this way, they really targeted them. But we withstood that, and we got reelected. But it was very tough.
Let's talk a little bit about the budget process itself. You mentioned that this was an important step in Congress trying to reassert its role in the government vis-a-vis the executive branch. But the Budget Act has procedural features to it that were only in the process of evolving in 1981, the Budget Act having been passed in 1974 and implemented the following year.
77, I think. Yeah.
77. And so one of the features of the Budget Act is that it requires the Congress to lay out a multi-year budget plan. And this was new for everybody, really, to get used to this idea that in calculating what you were going to propose for the coming year, the fiscal year, that you also had to be anticipating what was going to happen in the second and the third and the fourth and the fifth year out. And that required then reliance on assumptions about how the economy would perform and how programs would therefore be affected by it. So I'm wondering what this then leads to is a very elaborate set of budget calculations. In your congressional collections, we found documents that are an inch thick that lay out the various projections in 13 functional areas of the budget going 5 years out. So the whole thing seems sort of curious. How reliable are these numbers, and what kind of confidence could anybody have in their reliability, and how did the necessity of dealing with these multi-year budgets affect the politics of it in considering the Reagan proposal?
Well, I think first of all, I didn't put much reliability and confidence in 5-year budget projections because there are so many variables. Military actions, economic downturns, et cetera, that you couldn't predict. But I think one of the reasons they had these 5-year projections is Congress, maybe by habit, likes to put off tough decisions. And so you might put in the budget that you're going to cut spending by X amount, but it's going to start slowly. And it's only going to have this big impact on the 5th year. So it's farther out than anybody could plan right then. And so I think it was an attempt to try to get more realism in the budget. I don't think it worked. Congress still postpones as long as they can, cutting spending and things like that, or raising taxes or anything. But And so I didn't put a whole lot of confidence in the 5-year projections. I did put a lot of confidence in the first and second year projections, because if you make policy decisions, substantive decisions that have to be implemented in the first year, they're going to have, what the impact is going to be pretty accurately in the second year. And it forces Congress to make those decisions as opposed to postponing them.
Well, David Stockman writes that he was very well aware of this, and so Reagan had made a campaign promise that he was going to balance the budget by 1984. Right. And so in the context of the budget resolution then, that meant that the OMB had to show that whatever they were proposing was going to approximate balance by 1984. And so one way they could do that was by back-ending any spending cuts that so they wouldn't hit in the first 2 years, but they were, and some of which would have been entirely unrealistic to expect to have occurred. So what this leads to is sort of a symbolic fight, isn't it? Doesn't it become sort of symbolic at that point? Whether the Democratic budget is going to balance in 1984 or the Republican budget is going to balance, when nobody really knows what the numbers mean or could have any confidence that what is projected in 1981 would actually occur.
Yeah. No, and I think that's when I say Ronald Reagan was the major factor in victory or defeat on the budget, he really was, because he could take totally false numbers that David Stockman had put together and say it's going to balance the budget in 1984. We could show on the Democratic side that this was factually impossible, and it was our say versus Ronald Reagan's say, and Ronald Reagan wins that every time.
One important feature of the congressional budget process was is known as reconciliation. And the reason that this was put into effect originally under the Budget Act, they expected to have actually 2 budget resolutions. There would be a first budget resolution that would lay out the plan, and then there would be a confirmatory budget resolution in the fall, leading to the start of the fiscal year then in September. So reconciliation was a process on the basis of which if the appropriators had not satisfied the terms of the first budget resolution, then there would be a mechanism to enforce the targets. So in 1980, for the first time, before Reagan came into office during the Carter administration, reconciliation was employed on the first budget resolution. And that's what happened in 1981, is that there was going to be a reconciliation bill. There were what are called reconciliation instructions included in the first budget resolution, which then have to be implemented through a reconciliation process leading to a second vote on a reconciliation bill. Now, the difference between the budget resolution and the reconciliation bill is that the budget resolution is a plan, and the reconciliation bill actually changes public law. Right. So it has you're shooting with real bullets in the reconciliation process. So one of the things that could occur then is that even though the budget resolution sets out target numbers in each of the functional areas of the budget, it doesn't specify how you have to reach those numbers. Right. And that gives the authorizers and the appropriators an opportunity to put in place their own ideas about, what programs are going to be cut and how it's all going to add up. So this provided another opportunity then for the Democrats to blunt the force of the Reagan program if they could have produced a reconciliation bill that was more compatible with Democratic priorities than the ones that Reagan himself anticipated.
Right.
So that's a long-winded way of getting around to ask you the question of what happened during reconciliation and how did that fight compare to the one that you'd already had on the budget resolution? Was it simply a rerun of the previous fight, or were the politics of it a little different?
It was pretty much a rerun of the first budget resolution. It had a rerun of the tax showdown bill, which came in between those two legislative efforts, and it was basically again showcased from the administration's point of view as Reagan's revolution, Reagan's attempt to turn the economy around and move forward. And the specifics of it were very vague. And so we did have differences of opinion on what would be in the reconciliation bill. And that particular thing, I know Phil Gramm and Dave Stockman were working, and they presented a reconciliation package that was many, many pages. As I recall, they presented it to us like at midnight, and we voted on it the next morning, and nobody had read it, and it was impossible to know what was in it, and they were pushing to get this thing done, which they did, which cost them some votes the next year, 1982, because in the process of putting this together, they put some deep cuts in the poorest areas of Social Security. They did some other things that were just politically and economically inadvisable, but nobody had read it. And so it was, again, a showdown between every Republican and the boll weevils and the rest of the Democrats.
So one of the issues that the Democrats had to consider was the rule on the basis of which the reconciliation bill would be considered. And there was some sentiment for playing around with the structure of the rule in order to force the Republicans to cast difficult votes. The idea being that if the committees would come forward, one of the proposals, for example, was to close 1,000 post offices. Mm-hmm. And that was going to then, so then you put it in the bill, and then you make an order, a Republican amendment, and the Republicans have to decide whether they're going to vote to close all these post offices, as one kind of example. So the Republicans decided that they had to wage a fight on the rule itself in order to be able to ensure that what was called Gramm Latta 2, right, the reconciliation proposal that you've just described, would get a straight up or down vote against the Democratic alternative. So there were a series of key votes. The first was on the previous question on the rule, then on the rule itself, then on the Gramm Latta substitute amendment, and then on final passage. And they all were pretty much similar in character, except for the last vote, where there was some breaking of ranks on the Democratic side. But it was basically 217 to 211. Mm-hmm. So you lost control at the point of determining the rule on the basis of which the reconciliation bill was going to pass. Now, that's an arcane thing for the public to understand. They're not going to understand the arcanery of congressional processing in quite that way. And yet that was very much the crucial vote. So I'm wondering if it was still subject to the same overriding politics, that the only thing that mattered was whether you're for Reagan or you're against him, and it didn't make any difference what the vote was. Yeah,
no, very much so. And the rule is usually the leadership, speaker, majority leader, et cetera, position, and that is very important because that frames how the debate's going to occur, et cetera. And so it was positioned Tip O'Neill versus Ronald Reagan. And Tip O'Neill was considered an affable, fat Irish politician who always was spending money, smoking cigars, and you had Reagan, a very lovable, good-looking, and confidence-building president. So it was no contest, basically.
Well, still a pretty close vote, though.
It was a close vote.
Was there any point?
Because the leadership on the Democratic side really twisted an awful lot of arms.
That was what I was going to ask about. Yeah. And they must have had some success, right, in order to make it as close as they did. Let's shift attention, if we could, to the tax bill. Now, you're the chairman of the House Budget Committee, but you're also a member of the Ways and Means Committee. And as you've already described, you've been very active in tax policy in 1978 with the passage of the Jones-Steiger bill, was it? And then you worked with Barbara Conable, and so you've been involved in not only capital gains tax cuts, but accelerated depreciation and the like. Now, these kinds of tax policies are intended to be business-friendly. They're intended to try to stimulate economic growth by providing basically tax benefits to businesses so that they can operate more profitably. And so
they can make investments.
Yes, So they're actually supply side oriented. If you think of that term as being investment oriented as opposed to demand side oriented, which so now you're the chairman of the Budget Committee, but you're also on the Ways and Means Committee. And Dan Rostenkowski, who's the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, has a very strong personal interest in trying to win on this tax bill. And I'm wondering what role you played on the tax bill. Were you as active on that as you were on the budget resolution and the reconciliation bill because you were busy with those? Were you giving less attention to the tax bill? what was your posture on that tax bill?
I was involved in it, but I was very careful to make sure that Dan Rostenkowski was the leader on it. He was chairman of the committee. We were friends but competitors within the House. I would need his support on future things, so I did not want it to look like I was encroaching on his territory, his leadership, etc. I disagreed with Dan on when he started cutting taxes more than the Reagan program did in order to try to get votes on the floor, because I still believed that our number one target had to be deficit reduction, and that the more you cut taxes, the higher the deficit was going to be. But I basically let him take the lead. I didn't let him. I did not encroach on his leadership because I thought it was important to maintain a good relationship with him for future purposes.
Well, there was a bidding war, and the bidding war drove up the cost of that tax bill enormously. In his book, Stockman says very specifically that, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says something to the effect that any objective assessment of what occurred would recognize that it was the Republicans that started the bidding war on the tax bill and not the Democrats. Right. And I assume that to be the case, that Rostenkowski came forward with a set of tax proposals that threatened to win a majority of votes on the House floor, and so the Republicans started handing out the goodies, and then Rostenkowski decided that he wasn't going to lose if he could avoid it, and therefore he started matching them dollar for dollar.
Absolutely. No, it was irresponsible tax policy, but Danny was a very good politician, Chicago style, and he was determined not to lose, which he did. Which
he did. You know, he had an interesting choice to make, because in the 1980 election, John Bradamus, who'd been the Democratic whip, was defeated in his South Bend district. And so Rostenkowski had the option of either becoming the whip or taking the chairmanship of the Ways and Means Committee. And he chose the latter because he wanted to be a player in the economic fight that he saw coming. Right? And he had a reputation which I think was, I wouldn't say it was identical to yours because of different features of his district and his personality, but he did have a reputation as a guy that wanted to work in a bipartisan fashion on the committee.
Absolutely.
And that finally manifested itself when he was able to pass the 1986 tax bill, where they did have a major reduction in the marginal tax rates. So Rostenkowski wanted to win, and he engaged in the bidding war. And it looks to me as though that bidding war on the tax bill was probably the most serious mistake that was made at the time, because it took the revenue base of the government down 18%, whereas the spending levels never fell much below 20%.
Spending levels were around 22% of GDP, and the revenue was down to about 18%.
So is this the beginning of the politics that we see today? Now, you know, as a result of the things that happened later, I'm thinking of the Gramm-Redmond's hauling process. I'm thinking of the 1990 tax bill that George Herbert Walker Bush signed. I'm thinking of the Bill Clinton's first budget that involved raising taxes, so that by 1996-97, the government was in a position to actually balance the budget and produce a surplus, which was then taken away when George W. Bush came into office and essentially reduced the revenue surplus and
increased the spending.
Increased the spending, not just on the wars, but there was an expensive farm bill, there was an expensive transportation bill, there was
Social Security
Part D, all of that. So I don't think it's linear to say that what started in 1981 still had to plague us today, because they did reach a point at which we had dug ourselves out of the hole. But it does seem to me fair to say that the mentality that drove the 1981 policies is still very much with us. It's the reason why George W. Bush cut taxes the way that he did. And now we see that all of the 17 Republican candidates that were in the field at one time, every one of them had proposed substantial tax cuts as the platform of the Republican Party. I understand that Donald Trump's tax policies are the most expensive of all in terms of the hit they would take on the revenue base. So I'm just wondering how pivotal you see 1981 in that larger historical context. What do you see as being durable about how it has affected our politics, and or do you see it as having been, just one phase? How do you see it?
I think a couple of things came out of 1981. Number one, by having this partisan showdown where the Reagan budget and the Reagan program tax bill, along with solid Republicans and some Democrats, basically beat the rest of the Democrats. And so the tradition of developing policy in a more bipartisan way went out the window. And then that was followed up in 1982, where Tip O'Neill really creamed the Republicans on their cuts on Social Security in a very partisan way. And the partisanship developed, it just grew from that time forward, and it's to the highest degree right now. So that was one of the downsides of the 1981 exercise. And there were other downsides from my point of view. Some of the motivation for Republicans to not worry about the size, in reality, not worry about the size of the deficits that continued on to this day, was motivated by the fact that they wanted smaller government. They thought truly government was the enemy, as opposed to being an institution that helped people in many ways. And so they wanted to starve the government. And the only way they could starve the government was to get deficits so high that eventually they would just have to cut spending, cut. And so I think that also developed out of the 1981 exercise and is still with us today. Where it's going to go from here, it's hard to tell. And I have been preaching against deficits, well, even since before 1981. And the problem with deficits, you never know for sure when they're going to have their effect, negative effects, because as long as the U.S. can borrow money anywhere, to the point that a third or so of our budget deficits are financed by the Chinese. At some point, if the Chinese decide that the United States is weakened anyway and they want their money back, it's going to cause a huge economic problem for our country. You can't predict when that's going to happen because you don't know when your lenders are going to call their debts. So that's why I think it's really important that we keep a focus on the budget deficits and the national debt. Right now, I think it's at about, I think it's close to 80%, 70%, and when it gets over 100%, it's really dangerous. So that was also something that came out of 1981.
Do you recall when Dick Cheney was vice president and he said that deficits don't matter and that Ronald Reagan had proved that deficits don't matter?
Yep.
What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I think that the deficits hadn't caused the kind of catastrophic results that a number of us thought would happen. And we kept borrowing, and we kept financing our deficits by borrowing. And nobody had seen anything particularly bad happen with that. And so that's what I think he meant, is that we need to pursue our other goals, economic goals, and not worry about the deficits. I just think that's very dangerous.
I mean, if you look at not only the ratio of the total national debt to GDP, but you look at the projected policy deficit, which hasn't yet been realized because we're not talking about now the $17 trillion that we already owe. We're talking about what we're going to owe going forward in the future if policies aren't made to adjust. It seems to me that one could make the case that from the point of view of starving the beast, cutting the allowance, that was the way Ronald Reagan put it, that there's going to be tremendous pressure either to reduce spending or to increase revenues in some form or fashion, and that can't really be done without cutting deeply into the entitlement sector.
Yep. No, I think that's right. And at some point, in order to avoid the kind of spectacular negative effect that deficits and huge national debt can create, we're going to have a policy discussion that says, okay, we want a huge defense spending, we want Social Security, we want Medicare, we want all of these things, but we're going to have to pay for them. And if we're not willing to pay for them, we're going to have to cut. And that policy discussion really hasn't happened yet. We haven't been forced, as families are forced, to say, okay, we can no longer take that great holiday trip, or we can no longer eat out 2 or 3 times a week because we can't pay for it. And that's a discussion that's going to be very, very hard in the future.
I mean, one of the problems that you encounter is that if you take Paul Ryan as among the more responsible advocates, or serious advocates for deficit reduction, and yet he doesn't want to look at the revenue side of it in any substantial way.
Right.
And it seems to me as though the ideological position that he takes is essentially that which started back in the late 70s and the early 80s, right? That tax cuts are always good, so that mindset might be another thing that has survived from 1981.
No question about it.
Yeah.
No, that became Republican Party doctrine, and it was never explicitly said to starve the beast, but tax cuts, and people don't believe that adds to the deficit. A lot of people don't, and the fact that they've been told it doesn't, they would prefer to believe that.
Yeah. Well, Jim, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to visit with me this morning. And you're always welcome to come back to the University of Oklahoma and the Carl Albert Center. And
my alma mater.
We wish you Godspeed going forward.
Thank you, Ron.
All right, thanks a lot.
Take care.